Hello friends, I hope this video finds you well, wherever you find yourself. And thank you for joining me in a contemplative adventure with Spinoza's ethics. For today, we have a central definition, one of the most central definitions, which is to say his definition of God. And I say it's central because as we'll move forward through the text, we'll find out how his definition of God relates to the highest good, that is to say, the pursuit of the ethical life. And one could conceive of it or imagine it now, in part because this definition of God will relate to all our ideas as we go forward, so that all our ideas as we think about the text will resonate and come back to this original and, if I could put it this way, archetypical idea, the most full idea, which is to say, God or nature. And so understanding this definition will be central to understanding the rest of the text and also understanding his uptake or challenge of the tradition. Because someone might read his definition naively, like a scholastic or theologian, and say, ah yes, Spinoza, that is the definition of God. But in fact, he has a kind of subversive definition. Why I say that and why what I want to address is in a letter to Tschirnhaus, or letter 60, Spinoza reveals a little bit about his thought process regarding his definition. And specifically, it seems like he has a target or critique of someone like Descartes, or maybe Saint Anselm, and their definitions of God, and why he thinks that traditional definitions of God are insufficient and don't think of the logical conclusion of what God entails or what God means. And so this definition is meant as a kind of emendative one that sort of fixes or purifies the most essential components that make up as what Spinoza will think of as God, that is to say, nature. But before we get to that definition and get ahead of ourselves, I think we should try to summarize, as we have been, what we've deduced thus far. And I'll try to give some sort of helpful notes regarding what we've deduced thus far. So we've said that there is a causa sui, or defined a causa sui, whatever that thing is. It's the ground of itself. It affects itself. It causes itself. It entails itself. This is the most sort of essential thing because it necessarily exists even when we conceive of it. It's not just an imaginary thing. It necessarily exists. We defined, so that's the first definition, we define a finite thing. That which is, in a certain respect, the opposite of something like causa sui, something that is delimited, something that is either delimited in body or in thought, something that is finite. We've defined a substance, that which is in itself and conceived through itself, that which is the ground of itself, so to speak, that which holds itself on its own terms, sort of pulls itself from its own bootstraps, as it were, and does not rely on another thing to be conceived. That's the third definition. And then the fourth definition is an attributes, things that we predicate or constitute the essence of a substance, of a kind of order. The things that we know of as attributes for Spinoza are body or thought. These are attributes of substance. And then the fifth definition, which are modes. And modes, the most sort of commonsensical way, is finite things. Modes are not all modes in a weird way, but we'll find that out later in book 1. But the modes that we are most aware of, including ourselves, are finite modes. They are affections of substance. They are bodily things, or, if you want to put it this way, thought things. And so we have causa sui, which is to say substance, and attributes are the attributes of a substance, and we have modes as expressions of in different attributes of this one substance. So that sort of gives a summation of what we've gotten thus far, and the next definition that will be of central importance is God. Now, we should read the first definition. let's begin. By God, I understand a being absolutely infinite. That is, a substance consisting of an infinity of attributes, of which each attribute expresses an eternal and infinite essence. That's strange. This is interesting, right? He says there's an infinity of attributes. So usually in our day-to-day experience, we think of body, thought. These are attributes. But there are an infinity of attributes, Spinoza says. Maybe there could be other kinds of beings that are made up of a different kind of attribute or know God in a different way. But they would know God in the same way. God would be of the same order, that is to say, nature. God would not be different in this other attribute. It would just be seen from a different light, so to speak. Think of attributes as kind of prisms or glasses, as it were, that constitute from a different perspective God, but the essential element would be God or substance. They would be attributes of God or substance, expressions, as it were, of God or substance. I express myself in different ways. I'm happy, or I'm sad, or depressed, or not, hopefully, as you all are. And those would be expressions of one substance, of one thing, or one subjectum, if you want to put it that way. Now, the interesting thing is that he puts a clause to this. He gives an explanation of God, and I think in part he's motivated by by thinking of someone like Descartes and how Descartes defines God and gives a qualification specifically in what he means by God, because he thinks that Descartes' definition of God is insufficient, is inadequate for articulating this absolute infinite that is God or nature. So he says in a letter to Tschirnhaus, this is again letter 60. I will probably put up some of the writing of it. But he says, similarly, when I define God as a supremely perfect being, since that definition doesn't express the efficient cause, so this definition that's just merely a supremely perfect being, if I define God just God is a supremely perfect being, that's insufficient for Spinoza. For I understand the efficient cause to be both internal and external. So this definition doesn't express an efficient cause. It doesn't show, it's not generative. It doesn't have anything sort of expressive or an expressive force for Spinoza. I won't be able to derive all God's properties from it. But when I define God to be a being absolutely infinite, etc., see, and he points to definition 6, I can derive all God's properties from it. Right? So, for Spinoza, in contrast to someone like Descartes, God is absolutely infinite in every respect. So, to go to someone like Descartes, in, I believe, the second set of replies, in particular to Mersenne asked for a geometric proof of the Meditations. And therein, when Descartes replies to Mersenne, he replies with a geometric proof of his Meditations and defines God as a supremely perfect being that lacks nothing, that is not negated by anything. For Spinoza, that's an inadequate definition. It doesn't capture the full power or full positivity that is God. If we think of God, again, as an archetypical idea, as a kind of idea that's totally full, Spinoza is saying that Descartes doesn't fully think through the logical conclusion of what that entails, of what that means. In part, I think what he has in mind is that Descartes, in a certain respect, limits God, doesn't think through the full extent by which God would be an infinite thing and what it means to be an infinite thing. Descartes, in a certain respect, doesn't really think of the problem of the infinite and what it means for something to be an infinite thing. Whereas in the case of Spinoza, Spinoza is just taking the logical conclusion of what it means for something to be infinite and taking it to its full extent. is going fully through this idea. Descartes, in a weird way, inspires, I think, Spinoza. In the Meditations, Descartes speaks of an archetypical idea, of an idea that's full, that's the most intense. If we think of our previous video about Einstein and about the power of ideas to be generative and causal, God, for Spinoza and Descartes, is an archetypical idea, is the most full idea, lacks nothing, doesn't hold anything back, which is why, for Spinoza, God is not some Neoplatonic source that, as it spreads, so to speak, it sort of lacks something in its expression, so that finite things are somehow corruptions of this original source. But for Spinoza, God is entirely full, entirely expressed. I don't want to get too lost, but in what you might call modal metaphysical terms, Spinoza is an actualist. What is truly what is actual, and if it doesn't express itself fully in full intensity, then that thing is private and lacks something, is not perfect, could not be absolutely infinite. But God is absolutely infinite. So now we should read the explanation that Spinoza gives of God. And I think this qualifier will put into view why he thinks of his definition as in contrast or against someone like Descartes. So he says, explanation. I say absolutely infinite, not infinite in its own kind, for something is only infinite in its own kind. We can deny infinite attributes of it. And this is in the Naglach-Schriften, or the Dutch publication of Spinoza's Ethics. That is, we can conceive infinite attributes which do not pertain to its nature. But if something is absolutely infinite, whatever expresses essence and involves no negation pertains to its essence. And so one can see in this definition, or this explanandum, that Spinoza thinks that God is infinite in every degree, in every set. So if we go back to our parallel lines, you can think of it this way. They're these sets, they're infinite in their own sets, so thought or body or some other attribute, but God is not just infinite in one set, that is to say body or thought or another attribute, but infinite in every attribute, so that God, in a certain respect, is infinite in a lateral sense, vertical sense, but also infinite in every horizontal sense. And if the horizontal sort of lines are all the various different attributes that one could predicate of God, God is infinite in every respect. So someone like Descartes might think, well, God is not a body. God could not be an infinite body. But for Spinoza, that's totally intelligible, because Spinoza is just taking what it means for something to be infinite, absolutely infinite, to its logical conclusion. Infinite in every respect, infinite in every degree. God lacks nothing. God does not act behind the scenes, as it were. God acts and expresses itself in every attribute. And to sort of deny that would to negate some attribute of God. And one would be unable to wrestle with some attribute or not deduce all the attributes or properties of God. But God is absolutely infinite, as we said. And so this definition is central because it puts every idea or action that we could have, and it relates it back to this originative or primitive source, that is to say, God, as the source of all that is, or God or nature, as we put it. Right? We are natural beings, but all things, insofar as they are beings at all, are a part or partake in nature, this fully expressive force or generative force, that is to say, God or nature. So that's the sixth definition, and it's the central one. And eventually we'll find out that God, this absolutely infinite, is also causa sui, is also a substance. But we have yet to sort of deduce that and demonstrate that. Spinoza is not dogmatically asserting these things, but he's sort of getting the prep work. Think of it in our metaphor as a kind of architect or in the sort of line of Euclid's Elements, laying out the building blocks that are going to be the necessary premises for this enterprise. And that enterprise will eventually be necessary for understanding ethical action and something like the highest good and our place in nature, insofar as we are modes or affections of this one substance, which is to say, God or nature, a fully positive, absolute, infinite, absolute not just in one set, but absolute in every possible set, absolute in every kind, and not just in one kind, which the tradition usually thinks of as thought. God as just this thinking thing that thinks itself, as in Aristotle. But God could likewise be called an infinite body, or an infinite other attribute that we don't know because we are finite and we only know two attributes, which is to say body and intellect. This is the radicality of Spinoza and his definition of God, his radical taking the logical conclusion of what it means for something to be infinite to its absolute degree. That is to say, absolute infinite, which is, I don't want to get too sidetracked, but this is also why some mathematicians have attributed to Spinoza the first thinker of the infinite. And Leibniz, in letters, sort of goes back and sort of, there's a famous letter, which is called a letter 12, which is the famous letter on infinity that Leibniz comments on. So if one wants to think of it, of God, I keep saying Spinoza and God, but maybe that's true. In a certain respect, we all are expressions as modes of God. But if one wants to put it in a non-theological way, Spinoza is a thinker of the infinite, a thinker of infinity and what it means for something to be absolutely positive and lack nothing. That's all for now, and I'll find you some other time when I address, I believe, what are the next set of definitions? Right, freedom and eternity. I think I'll address those in one video and the next video. See y'all.